Welcome back everybody to our C++ text RPG tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at the Selector class. We're going to need different ways to move through the menus in the game. RPGs have many uses for selectors. We have shops, we have items, we have equipment, we have magic, we have battle systems, and there's many more that we're not going to get into here. However, it's important for us to know. So the selectors are going to have parameters. What do we need to keep track of? So basically you want to think of a selector as a 2D grid, our X and Y coordinates of the top left corner, and then all movement is based off of that. So if you want to move over, you're moving over in your columns, or you're moving over in the rows. We need to know the number of columns. We're going to need to know the number of rows. We're going to need to know the space between the rows, so we know how far to move the cursor down when we cursor down. And we're going to need to know the space between the columns, so we know how far to move the cursor over when we move to the side. We're also going to need to know the sprite of the cursor. In our case, it's going to be an ASCII character. We won't be using a beautiful hand selector like this. We're going to be just using an ASCII character or ASCII string. And here's a little snippet of our selector parameters of what it's going to look like. So if you can see, we have an X, a Y, we have the columns, we have the current X, we have the current Y. You have to consider the current X would be basically your current column, and your current Y would basically be your current row. Which row are you pointing at? The space between the X, the space between the Y, and the cursor itself. If you see here, we're using a W string for our cursor, and we're going to have some default values when we first put these in. So X and Y, if you look right here, is 25 and 10. What is 25? That's where it's starting. 25 characters over and 10 characters down. That's just a default. You can change it to whatever you want. Number of columns, 1. Current X, 0, 0. We're just going to, and current spacing, 20 characters. We're going to want 20 characters in between at the beginning, because we don't know the actual size of the word that we're going to be using. So 20 is actually probably pushing it a bit far. However, I've tested it and it seems to be working. And 5 characters in between, you can change that down to 1 if you like. But we'll do some testing with that inside. And our default cursor is going to just be like a little arrow. Okay, so let's get into creating the selector class. All right, everybody. So let's start working on this selector class. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new header file. And we'll call this selector.h. And as discussed in the slides, we're going to want to make our parameters, but let's include a few things first. All right, so some things that we're going to need are include functional, include algorithm, include vector, include string, include type traits. So the reason I want to use type traits is I want to check if the type of the template is a W string. If it's not a W string, I don't want it to try to write unless they have overridden the draw function, but we'll get into that later. We're going to need the console, and then we're going to need a keyboard, and we should have the logger as well. Okay, so let's create the selector parameters. So we're going to need a struct selector params. So we want our X position. You know, I was putting MX and that, but we're using a struct here, so let's do just X, Y, columns, current X, current Y, spacing X, spacing Y. That should be good. Start, and then stdw string. We want our cursor. And then we'll create a constructor, selector params, and in that constructor we will have some default values. So we're going to go int x is equal to 20, int y is equal to 20. Now that is just your XY coordinates on your screen. So if you have a box, it'll be X, Y, 20 in and 20 down. Now 20 down might be too big, because if you remember back when we did check the size of the text, it is 16 to 8. So let's put this to 10, so it's half. And then int columns is equal to 1, int current X 0, int current Y equals 0, int spacing X is equal to 20. I'm putting spacing X to 20 because it's 20 characters. So 20 characters may be a lot, you may want to change that, but that's why we're doing the selector parameter, so you can change it if you need. And then you go spacing, spacing Y is equal to 5. That's got to have a type, so it's an integer. Let's put this down on the next line. And let's do std w string cursor, and we're going to want to have that equal to just an arrow. And we can change that if we need to. So if you don't put it in, it will just be an arrow. That will be your cursor. So let's set our variables. So this X is equal to X. Same for Y. And then columns. Whoops. So I'm hitting Control D to copy this line down. Oops. Now the cursor equal to cursor. All right, so we have our default parameters and we're good. So now it's time to get into creating the actual selector class. And as I stated, it's going to be a template class because we're going to have different types that we're going to want to check. But that means we're going to have to override some functions. All right, so the reason why I wanted to use a template here is because our data may change. It might not always be a W string. Even though we use a W string when we're writing to the console, we still want to be able to change and manipulate the data. So some functions are going to have to be overridden by us so we can use that data. And not all data has a output string operator automatically. So you have to create your own function for that to write to the console, because everything needs to write to the console in this. So template, type name T. Now we're going to have a default type name of W string. Our type will default to W string if you do not put one in. So, and then as class selector. So we're going to have, just like before, we're going to do our private, public, and we'll go from there. So what are we going to need? We're going to need the console, because we have to write to the console. Call that mConsole. We're going to need a keyboard. And keyboard. And now, the fun part. So now we need to use std function. Std function void int std vector t and we'll call this on selection. Let's look at std function for a second. So what is std function? I was trying to think of a good way to explain this that a little bit better than CPP reference. Oh yeah, if you really want some good info, come to cppreference.com and look for whatever you need. However, I found this great definition right here. This person says a function pointer is an address of an actual function defined in C++. where std function is a wrapper that can hold any type of callable objects that can be used like functions. So that's what we're going to use here. Stack Overflow is also your friend. So, and we're also going to probably be needing to use std bind and placeholders, but we'll get into that when we start using it. So let's do another function for drawing. Std function, this one also is void. So void is our return type, and then we have our input parameters. So here with this one, int is going to be our index, what index of the data that we have. That's basically what that is. So we're selecting at this index the data, whichever data is at this index. So now for the draw function, we're going to have int, so that's basically your x, your y position, and then t for data. So what item are we selected are we drawing here? Like what are we drawing right here? So m on draw item. And then we're also going to need our data, so that's std vector t m data. We're going to need our parameters, so selector params. We'll just call it m params. We're going to need also a bool mb show cursor, so you can hide the cursor and show the cursor when you need to. We're also going to need the rows, int m rows, and these rows are determined by the number of columns and the size of the data. That's what we have. That's how we determine the rows, and we'll be doing that in the constructor. Okay, so let's get into creating the constructors. All right, so let's start writing some functions that we're going to use with the selector. So first thing we're going to have is we're going to have the selector constructor. We'll get more into that in a minute. We're going to have a destructor. We need to have a way to set the data. Void set data. We need a way to get the data. Const std vector t reference get data. And we can just do that here. Oops. We can do this here as well. Let's have a way to set the select selection func. And we're going to need a way to set the draw function. That's a good thing about std function is that it is assignable. So if you come back here, it shows that it does assign a new target. Let's go back. Okay. Just like everything in here, we're going to have to process our inputs for our keyboard. So void process inputs. We're also going to need to move up. So we want to move cursor up, move down, move left, move right, up, down, left, right, down, left, right. And then, so that's for our inputs. And then we're going to need to, let's say, draw item. Draw item is going to need int x, int y, and t item. So this basically is going to be our default. If we do not provide a new function, this will be our default. It'll default back to this, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then we're going to have an on selection. Same idea. These need to be void. Sorry, void on selection. This will also be a default if it's not provided. This is an index, sorry. And this is std vector t data. Quickly write the show cursor functions and hide cursor functions. So let's just go let's just go void show cursor. Now you could write it as one function and just say true or false, but I'm just going to write two functions so you don't have to put in anything. So show cursor is going to be mb show cursor is equal to true, and hide will be false. Change this to hide. Cool. So those, we have those. And then what else are we going to need? We're going to need an action. So on action. We can put that with our inputs. Void on action. Or you could say on selection. No, we already have on selection. So on action. And we're going to need a way to get the index. So let's return the index. So an index is an int, so const int get index. Const. We don't need to be able to change that. So then return and so then params dot current x plus params dot current y times and params dot columns. And then the last but not least, void draw. All right. Okay, so we got this started, and this seems like a long enough video for now. So tune into the next video and we will implement these functions. Thank you.